and I'm going to start this lecture. So, a little bit about myself before I started. So, my name is Molton. I'm a Grandmaster from Australia, and I've started playing chess since I was 11 years old, and I've been playing for basically the past 15 plus years. And the goal for today's lecture is really not to teach you any specific opening theory or anything like that, but it's more to just give you an understanding of how to sort of get started building a repertoire. If you're a beginner, or even if you're like intermediate or advanced, then it could be helpful if you're looking to switch or find something a little bit more suitable. So the goal here is really to save you time in the long run, because I feel that if you play the wrong openings from the start, then you can waste a lot of time. And I'm going to give you some sort of hints I worked out along the way, and just some general helpful advice that might save you some time. So I'm going to get started with how I got started into chess. So when I first started building my opening repertoire, I didn't really have any idea what I was doing. I sort of just played whatever I liked and whatever I picked up and started to read and learn. That's what I got started with. So the very first opening I got started with was the King's Gambit, which most people don't really start on this because they're learning stuff like the fried liver and all sorts of other openings. But this was the one that really got me interested in chess at the very beginning, anyway. So this stuck with me basically throughout my whole entire chess career so far, and it's still one of my favorite openings to play. So, and from the black side, I remember I first got started from some videos with the Scandinavian Defense. So my repertoire was a little bit different from most people. So I started with something like this, and it was something simple, and I just learned some basic ideas, and that's how I moved on from there. So later on, after the Scandinavian, I switched my repertoire to the French. So this was my second opening. I started playing with the black side, and I played this for quite a long time, probably way too long. And I found out much later, maybe 4 or 5 years in, that the French is probably not the right opening for me. And I just wasn't liking the positions. They were very closed, and they just weren't suiting to my sort of playing style. And I really didn't enjoy it that much. But at the time, I didn't really know anything else. So I just stuck with what I learned. I think I got this from a book by Gufeld, excellent player, by the way. And I recommend it if you do play the French. And after the French, I kept switching. So finally, I switched to the Sicilian defense after that. And I started playing the Accelerated Dragon from the black side. So something like this: Bishop g7. And I got into some interesting positions, but eventually I also ran into trouble against the Maroczy bind. So after positions, after c4, I just didn't really like these sort of cramped positions. And it was it was not for a long time that I finally sort of found my way into some openings which I actually was good at. So later on, I discovered that the Khan Sicilian was sort of my staple opening, and I was doing really well with the Khan. And I've played the Khan ever since. It's one of my mainline openings in my repertoire now. And I also switched to, say, the Taimanov, which is also one of my mainline openings. So I really enjoyed the Sicilian, and it took me a long time to actually find that out, because when I first started, I never really had a coach to sort of tell me to play this or to play that. So there was a lot of sort of trial and error and experimenting. And it was only after I played the Sicilian later on in my career, I sort of switched again to learning more solid e4, e5 openings. And as white, I also started switching from e4 to d4 gradually. So the whole point of that, I think, is just to show you that it took me ages before I actually developed an opening repertoire for myself. And hopefully, if you have someone just to tell you or guide you through the process, it might be a lot easier for you, and it'll save you a lot more time. So I think for the first steps and first tips for how to create an opening repertoire, at least from my experiences in the past, I think is just to look through your strengths and weaknesses. That should be your first goal. And also look at what level you're starting at. But I think strengths and weaknesses is a good starting point. So, what positions are you good at playing? What positions are you not so good at playing? And sort of work on a repertoire which fits into mainly your strengths. Okay. And so, also, what goals do you have when you're starting out your repertoire? So, depending on your goals, you should change your openings accordingly as well. So, for example, if your goal is to become a grandmaster in the future, then maybe you need something a little bit more long term rather than playing openings which will only last you for a few hundred points and then switching anyway. Whereas if your goal is to say win a club championship or just to do well in a certain tournament, then you can sort of change your repertoire and play openings which maybe are just short term in nature. Also, what you should consider is maybe the time as well you need to spend on each opening because certain openings would take you quite a lot of time to actually learn. So, for example, if you're trying to go in and try and learn a mainline Najdorf straight away, that's going to be a really intensive opening, and there's going to be a lot of theory into this type of opening, and it's going to take you a long time to learn. So, for openings like this, I guess it's something you'll learn throughout your whole lifetime and you improve on. So, when it comes to openings, there are mainly two approaches I see people taking. One approach is either to go in and just learn a few openings really, really well. Or another approach is to learn a bit of everything. So I guess for me, I'm sort of the second one where I learn a bit of everything. But even then, I still have some of my mainline openings, which I go back to every so often. So the good thing about learning just one or two openings is that you'll know it really, really well and it'll last with you for a long time. Whereas if you sort of switch back and forth to a lot of things, it can be difficult because you might not know it or have experience in it, especially if you don't get to play as much as your opponent does. So, especially if you're starting out, I would suggest that you stick to maybe just one or two lines and learn that really well first, and then move on from there. So, in terms of the actual lines that you pick, I don't think there's too much of a preference, and it's not that important, especially when you're starting out. Like I said, I started out with the Scandinavian and King's Gambit. I don't think King's Gambit is particularly a beginner type of opening. And the Scandinavian is probably not the best opening either, but I think it's totally fine when you're starting out. It doesn't really matter, especially if you're playing an opening not many people know. I think as long as you learn it well and put in the time to study the ideas and so on, then what you'll find is a lot of your opponents won't actually know how to respond against it. And I think you can do well this way as well. So, and another thing is also not to avoid lines just because there's a lot of theory in them. So I see a lot of people just not playing particular openings because maybe they're worried that there's too much to learn or their opponent has some preparation in that particular line. The Najdorf is a good example of this as well. So, for example, in the Najdorf, a lot of people won't play into an open Sicilian and they'll go into like some sideline just because they're worried there's too much theory here. So maybe from the black side, there is a lot of theory. So if you're playing from the black side of such an opening as a Grunfeld, King's Indian, Najdorf, such openings, you will have to learn quite a bit. But if you're playing against it, I feel that it's not so bad, and you're really only learning one specific line to play against each opening. And as long as you know your line well, it's not as bad as from the black side, who has to actually put in a lot more work to sort of equalize and get a playable position here. And I think the last thing I want to touch on is basically just to play what you enjoy. So as long as you're playing something that you like and the type of positions you are good at, then it should be fine as well. Okay, so I think once you've sort of picked out your sort of opening repertoire and what you want to get started on, I think the next step is to maybe create a database or some sort of place where you can put in all your notes. So the one I use is Chessbase. So I use Chessbase for all my notes. So once I've decided on an opening, I will create a database, and that's where I'll store all my opening repertoire. So so for example, I'll go something like this, but you can also use other things like Skid or any sort of free version of databases as well. Also, Lichess is a great one as well. So, for example, I'd go in and I just create a folder there, and let's say repertoire. And what you do is you can create like different databases for whatever opening line you're playing. And then what I do is just store all my lines in there. So any work you've done on that particular opening is not lost, and you can always go back and refer to it later on. For example, something like this, I'll have like specific lines there. And this is a good way to sort of just keep track of your openings, and any work you've done is always saved. You can also sort of just save it and then have it backed up on, say, your phone or anywhere else where you can sort of just check up and refresh on lines, even when you're not at your computer. So another thing when you're learning openings, which I find very useful, is to have example games. So for example, here in the Smith Mora, what I'd do is I'd have my specific lines of what I would play against each variation. But then I'd also have some STEM games or example games. And the whole point of these STEM games and example games is really um, some model games in each particular variation, which is going to give me an idea as soon as I flick through it of what I'm meant to do. And I think this is a good way to learn your openings and to just um, remember the ideas. So this way you don't have to remember specific lines or anything like that, but instead you can remember the STEM games and the ideas that come along with it. So for example, just looking at this STEM game, I can get a refresher on what I'm supposed to do in this Smith Mara Gambit line. If black declines it and plays the move pawn to d3, I know that I can see that I'm supposed to put the pawn on c4, and just from looking at this game, I can sort of get a understanding of what I'm supposed to do. Put the pawn on h3 and so on, where I put my pieces and the plans that come along afterwards into the middle game, and so on. So So this is how I study my openings and sort of keep track of each one. So I think this is a good method to use a database. If not, you can also just use Lichess. I think Lichess is excellent. I have a lot of my lines stored on Lichess as well, especially this sort of opening feature in Lichess. I find this very useful. Um, I think chess.com may have something similar as well. So it doesn't really matter where it is, as long as you have somewhere where you can sort of save your lines, so you're not going back and forth and working on the same thing over and over again multiple times. So in terms of actually learning your openings, so I used to learn from books, but then I found that with books they're very specific to what the author is recommending. So later on I started just self-learning through databases and YouTube videos, DVDs, and I would watch sort of live events and follow players. I think following players is a also a very good way of learning your openings. So, for example, when I was learning the King's Indian Defense, of course, you should follow players which are so good models in that particular opening. So, the main players I would follow for an opening, such as King's Indian, would be guys like Hikaru, and then Ding Liren, Rajabov. So it's good to have model players in each line. For London, I would follow players like Kamsky, Magnus, for example. And this way, I can actually, when I'm looking through their games in live events, I can actually see what they're doing, new ideas they're coming up with. And it just gives me um, sort of a better idea of how to play their opening. Just from looking at someone, I can sort of trust what they're doing. For example, I used to follow MVL for, say, the Najdorf and also the Grunfeld. So stuff like this. I think it's important that you have sort of a few players that you follow for your openings. That will give you a sort of a better way of just keeping tabs. And the next thing I want to go over quickly is just maybe some examples of how I would go around building repertoires for different situations. So these are some repertoires I've sort of built for some of my own students in the past, and each one is different. It depends on like what your goals are, your time, and so on, and what you're looking to achieve with it, of course. But I'll give you some examples, and what I'll actually do is maybe just move into Q&A afterwards, because I feel that with openings it's very specific to different players. So, but these are some examples of what I've done in the past for different people. So, for example, one player was very solid. I mean, he was starting out and he was maybe roughly about 1200 or 1300 online, but he was looking for something very solid, and he also had a playing style to sort of fit with that. So he wasn't going for any complications. So we ended up with going for a repertoire which was fairly simple. So when you're starting out chess, you want to go for something fairly simple. I would suggest repertoires involving setups, something like the London or Catalan, where you're not looking at too many specific opening variations, but rather just focusing on other aspects of the game. Because when you're starting out, I don't think openings is the most important, as I mentioned. So we ended up with the white pieces working on something like the Catalan, which I think is a great start for anyone looking to play, say, d4, because it's very simple. I mean, you just always fianchetto the bishop and get these sort of setups all the time. And after a while, once you're familiar with the ideas and you sort of got a basis and grasp of all the opening principles, then you can sort of move on to more specific lines after that. And with the black side, what happened was he was playing something along the lines of a Slav, so something like this, which was very solid, and they were happy with something where they were getting some sort of positions where they had a rough idea of what to do and just easy piece development just to get them out of the opening. So we ended up going for something like this, some sort of semi-Slav or maybe some open Slav where they just take here and then put the bishop out and just developing their pieces really. Yeah. And because of this, playing the Slav against d4, we ended up actually suggesting against e4 something very similar. So in order to save time, I think it's good to stick to similar structures as well, especially if you're a very solid player and you just um, want a position after the opening which you can play. So we ended up going for something like the Caro-Kann, since at the lower level most people were just going to take the pawn anyway, and then they would get into some structure like this, which was very similar to what he got in the Slav. So this is one of the repertoires I ended up recommending. And then we got into another repertoire. So this player actually wanted sidelines instead. So they wanted to play sort of e4, d4, but they didn't want to go into all the theory of, say, any of the main lines. So what I ended up doing for this player was going for something a little bit more sharper, because they were quite a tactical player. But at the same time, they didn't want to go into all the mainline theory because they didn't have time to study all that. So for example, let's say e4, e5. So instead of going into, say, a Roy Lopez, which would be quite time consuming to learn all the ideas, but I think it's a really good opening to learn, as well as, say, the Italian, we ended up for going for something like the Scotch instead. Scotch Gambit, or the Scotch with knight takes d4. Something like this where it's not as common, but at the same time, it's not a completely outrageous opening where it's just a one-off. So the Scotch is something that you can play as, I guess, your mainline repertoire for quite a long time. Um, Same with things like the King's Gambit, as well as, let's say, the Vienna is also a good option for people who are starting out and want something a little bit different. And then against e4, c5, what I ended up doing for that repertoire was going for some sort of sidelines. I think I started them off with the Smith-Morra Gambit. But again, the Smith-Morra Gambit is one of these openings which isn't a long-term thing. It's mainly a surprise opening and something that you play maybe at a lower level. And it's not something you're going to have in your repertoire for a long time. But what it does teach you playing gambits is, I guess, to play a lot more aggressively and improve your tactics. Eventually, we switched from that into a c3 Sicilian, which is what they wanted. And I think overall they were fairly happy with this type of positions because they got their sort of aggressive attacking chess, but at the same time they didn't um, have to go into all the main lines, which they were trying to avoid. So this is another example of sort of sideline repertoire. And then we got into another player who was more mainline, but at the same time didn't want to go too mainline. So you can play main lines, but at the same time just deviate a little bit. So an example of this might be, let's say after d4, instead of going for a mainline d4 and sort of the bishop g5 type knight-offs or the bishop e3 knight-offs, which everyone is playing and everyone knows about, you could opt for something a little bit more sideline-ish, something like f4, which people haven't played in a long time. So this is another good option. I've seen some people, they opt for moves like rook g1 here. So even if you go into a mainline, doesn't necessarily mean you have to go into the most popular move there. So there's lots of ways to um, avoid sort of going into that. And then there's sort of the player who just wants to improve over the really long term, and I guess their goals are to reach sort of a much higher master level. And for those ones, I sort of recommend repertoires where it's going to be a lot more solid and something that isn't really one off. It's something you can play for a long time. So for those ones, I usually recommend sort of more the Roy Lopez type openings, Queen's Gambits, Italians, and maybe stuff which is going to stick in your repertoire and you can play for a long time. Um, Whereas if you have sidelines at King's Gambit, you probably need a few sidelines in there to make it worthwhile. So another example repertoire which I was building from the black side, very similar to the Karakan one. I think for this person, they were just looking to save a lot of time and they wanted openings where they would sort of interchange and transpose within one another. And I think they were mainly learning the King's Indian. So King's Indian and Pirk. So I find a lot of people who play against e4 and d4 and want to stick with, say, the King's Indian or Fianchetto setup will go for like King's Indian, Pirk, modern type of structures. So for example, if you play the King's Indian here after knight f6, c4, something like this, this is one particular opening and it's completely different from the Pirk. So for this one, you'd have to learn like this entire opening from scratch. Whereas if you play something along the lines of g6, it can transpose to say e4, d4. So I know a lot of people who will play like g6 as one of their mainline openings. And I'll just stick with this and they'll get some sort of modern type of position here. after a d6. And yeah, they'll play some sort of Pirc or modern setup, which I think is perfectly fine if you're looking to sort of save a lot of time learning too many different openings. And against the c4 structure, I've seen people opt for, say, d6, and instead of going into sort of mainline knight f6 openings, what they do is just play some sort of sideline, maybe e5, and maybe put the knight on d7, which avoids a lot of theory, but sort of goes into the type of structure which they're comfortable with. Okay. So I think once you've sort of got a grasp on what your opening repertoire is like, and once you've sort of built it and sort of written it out or have it in like a database, I think the next step in order to actually get better is to sort of come familiar with the actual opening structures that arise from what you're playing. So, for example, if you play this opening a lot as the black pieces, then you're going to get a lot of structures like this. So this is going to be like a King's Indian structure. So what you should be doing is learning middle games to do with King's Indian structures, especially if you're starting out at like beginner, intermediate. I don't think specific opening moves are going to help you improve necessarily that much. It only helps if it's a very specific line, it's very sharp line, something like the Botvinnik, or let's say a mainline knight off bishop g5, then maybe you do need to learn specific theory. But in general, I think learning the actual structure of the middle game is going to help you a lot more. So, for example, depending on what you play, you'll get completely different structures. So if you play against a c3 Sicilian a lot, then you're going to get IQP, or isolated queen pawn structures. So what you should be doing is learning this particular structure and what to do against, say, the isolated queen pawn. And this will help you a lot more than, say, learning specific opening theory. So, as an example of that, what I usually do to sort of learn my middle games is just look at the actual plans and the actual structures that arise. So, for example, here I have some familiar structures. Let's say this one was the King's Indian structure. So what do we do in the King's Indian structure? Well, here's sort of an idea of what you should be familiar with. Let's say as white, of course, we want to go for c4, c5. As black, they want to go for f5. So stuff like this, just knowing the actual plans in each position, as soon as you see the pawn structure enter the board, will save you a lot of time in your games, and also will give you a sort of good plan to follow instead of having to make it up over the board. It's very rare that in chess you'll reach a pawn structure that you've never ever seen before, or that has never arisen ever before. Most of the pawn structures which arise in chess will stick to sort of the common ones here. So, for example, this is another one you might get from the King's Indian. So, if you play King's Indian, you might need to learn the first pawn structure, second pawn structure. Whereas this one, immediately, just from the pawn structure, you should be able to tell what opening this could arise from. So this one is a French defense. So if you play a French defense, you should look at this pawn structure, and so on and so forth. Here we have a Caro-Kann pawn structure. It can also come from, say, a Scandinavian. And we should be familiar with sort of the key ideas of what to do for each side here. And the pawn structures go on and on. But you don't need to learn all of them. You should just learn the pawn structures which arise from your particular opening. And I think this is a good way to learn your middle games and sort of complement any other material you're studying alongside with it. Okay, so basically that's my suggestions on when building a repertoire from the beginning. And that's how I sort of build my own repertoire. So I firstly just looked at, again, um, the different factors which would influence my decision. And then I finally made a decision on what repertoire I wanted to learn. And after I got my repertoire down pat, I would sort of create the databases and then store all my lines. And then I would follow specific plays. I learn from different source material, YouTube, and so on. And after that, I would go on and actually learn the specific middle game structures. And I think that's a lot easier way to sort of improve instead of trying to just focus solely on the opening. So especially in, like I said, the beginner to intermediate range. So I think what we can do now is switch to the Q&A, and I can sort of answer any specific questions about openings people might have.
Okay, there's a question in the lecture chat right now by someone, by Soja Cat. You can read it.
So I think I'll switch to the lecture chat one, right?
Yeah, that's where everyone will be asking their questions. So, Molton, actually, if you stop streaming, then the 25-man limit will be canceled, and everyone will be able to
Yeah, so
listen to your
I'm in the
answer.
lecture chat one, so I'll just answer any questions if people want any questions on specific openings and so on. I'll have a look and answer through. So question, is it possible to minimize or streamline opening study by picking openings that complement each other? E.g. d4 and e4 replies for black that transpose into one another or that have similar ideas? Yeah, definitely. So I think if you pick openings which sort of complement each other in terms of the actual middle game structures, as I mentioned before, so if they're all going to sort of IQP positions. So if you like playing against IQP, for example, let's say you like playing this type of position for black, then what I would do is, or stick with this throughout. So look for openings which lead into those type of positions. So if you're playing against d4 and you like playing against IQPs, maybe don't go for a King's Indian because King's Indians almost never will reach an IQP. Instead, opt for maybe a Nimzo or sort of Queen's Gambit or Slav. Then you might get into an IQP position. So probably a Nimzo, something like this. Let's say could possibly reach an IQP position. So something like this is very common. And take. So we have into an IQP structure. And depending on which pawn structures you find that you enjoy most and you're good at and you like, then I would stick to openings which sort of go into those middle games often. So if a top player likes opening X against the French and opening Y against the modern, and I play opening X, should I consider playing opening Y? Hmm. I think I need a specific example for that one. I think it sort of depends. It depends on the opening, I think. And yeah, a lot of people play Rook G1 against the knight off. Actually, maybe I'll do sort of another video covering all the specific responses you can do against the knight off. There's quite a lot from what I know, and most of them are playable. So what percentage of opening work is opening books, instructive games, and engine work? So for me personally, I didn't use an engine heavily until I was going for like a master title. So I would say it's not that important at when you're starting out. So like even up until 2200, I think I would only use it really for blunder checking, so tactics and so on. I wouldn't try to use it to understand moves as much. So I think especially when you're starting out, sometimes the engine will give suggestions and the moves make no sense to a human whatsoever. And I think it's important that you sort of create meaning behind the moves. Otherwise, it's very difficult uh, to sort of develop your understanding of the middle game. I used a lot of opening books when I first started, but then, like I said, I sort of switched. I didn't use them as much, and I sort of move into instructive games and databases. That way, I can sort of pick and choose what I want to play myself instead of specifically going into what authors recommend. Although, if you want to start, then sometimes opening books are also very good way to just get started. Do you have good recommendations against the French? Um, you can play basically anything against the French, really, apart from say the exchange French. So the only one I probably wouldn't recommend is exchange French because you don't really pose too many problems for black. But I think anything here is fine. Like I think I've made a video in the past recommending, um, say the two knights, and I think anything where you're blocking the bishop and not allowing the bishop outside the pawn chain is a good option. So the four knights is a good option. Because the bishop is stuck here. So just learning to play this pawn structure in general is helpful from the white side because you know what to do when black has a blockaded bishop like this, and also the jet plans that come along with it. And same goes for, let's say, you could play the Winawa, although there's a lot of theory in the Winawa, but that's also a good option. And my main line nowadays is the Tarash. So I like this the most. So this is what I would recommend if you want sort of a long-term repertoire against the French. I would look into the Tarash. But again, there are many lines you can play. If you want something easy, I know Bishop D3 is very popular now. Stuff like this where the bishop just sits on F3. But again, I would go for Tarash myself, or two knights, or knight C3. These would be my main ones, or E5, something like this is also good. Yeah, okay. French players will be familiar with this pawn structure a lot, of course, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good structure for black. I think it's far more difficult to play for black than it is to play for white. So I don't think you should avoid it. I think you should go into it and just learn it. Yeah. Okay. So poison pawn opening. So poison pawn opening in the actual knight off. That's a very high theoretical opening. So you definitely need to know what you're doing from the black side, especially. Mhm. Well, if you're playing poison pawn in this first place, you probably really need to know what you're doing because you can't go into a poison pawn from the black side without knowing the main responses, which is e5 and f5. Um, so poison pawn is something like this. For those who aren't unfamiliar with this opening, and yeah, and I think what the question is about is the move pawn to e5 here, which can get extremely theoretical. So I think black is supposed to play the move pawn to h6 first and then capture the pawn, and then there's just a whole lot of theory here from both sides. You need to know what you're doing. Personally, I like the move pawn to e5, but I know it's fine for black as well. You just need to know what you're doing. Yeah, so if you don't like the move pawn to e5 and you don't want to learn it though, but you should probably just learn something different against bishop g5 specifically. Maybe play another sideline from the black side. So a question here is, one of the main ways to study openings for them right now is to use the database book feature on Lichess, which I mentioned is really, really helpful, and to see the top moves players are making in the Lichess database as well as the non-master database. So for people who don't know that you can actually switch the databases here, if you go into the opening book, you can click here, and if you go there, that will be all the masters games in over the board tournaments, and then if you click Lichess, this will be all of the games played online in the Lichess database. So this is helpful as well if you want to switch and check what has been played. So in a lot of offbeat openings like the knight f6 Scandi, the natural top moves get refuted by stockfish, and a lot of the times we end up getting a huge advantage. Um, so yeah, I showed you a line yesterday where the number one moves played by the players just leads to a trap, which force wins the game. Even if they don't fall for the trap, black was still better. What do you think about this approach, and do you think it works at master level still? Okay, so this player is talking about something like this, and queen takes d5 Scandinavian from the black side, and they're going for sort of specific lines here which lead to an advantage for black. So so this is okay, but I would say that once you get higher and higher into a master level, even just from looking at the top games here, we can see that um, white is going to be a lot more careful with his moves, and they're not going to go for anything which they think is going to be very unclear. So they'll try and avoid sort of the unclear variations that we looked at earlier. So probably at a master level, I would say it won't work, but you can definitely try it out. So what's the best square for the queen in the Leningrad Dutch as black? Okay, so the Leningrad Dutch is one of these opening repertoires for players who want something a little bit offbeat, but they want to go in sort of tactical and fairly aggressive type of positions in middle games. But they say they want to avoid all the theory of a King's Indian. So they want similar structures and similar middle games where they can attack, but at the same time, they want to avoid a lot of theory. Then I would go for something like the Dutch, which is a little bit more offbeat, and a lot of players from the white side probably haven't faced it nearly as much. So overall, I think the Dutch is a great opening option if this fits what you're going for. Yeah, so it really depends. And in terms of which square is best for the queen, again, that really depends on the position. So let's say some position like this. I mean, typically what I would do for the queen in the Dutch is put it to e8, where it's probably the most useful, or c7, where it supports e5. So this is very specific, but let's say if you put the queen on c7, it does support the move pawn to e5, which is one of your main pawn breaks in the Dutch. So this is the main move you want to get, e5, and then eventually maybe e4 as well. And then maybe push g5, f4, and launch a sort of kingside attack. So putting the queen on c7 makes sense to support e5, but you can also achieve the exact same thing by putting the queen on e8. So this is also an excellent square for the queen in the Dutch. So something like this is very normal. And eventually you'd want to push the pawn to e5 if you can, and get some sort of structure like this. And the queen on e8, similar to a King's Indian, it will actually appear on the king side later on. So you can play h6, push g5, and maybe swing the queen to g6. And from here, the queen, you can see, is actually a very dangerous attacking piece. So yeah, these are some of the ideas in the Dutch. So should one pick complementary replies to the French and the Caracan? Um, I think they're two very different structures, though. So what I would recommend is you learn the French structure, because it's very important that you do learn what to do against this structure, because I think it will arise a lot in not just the French, but you could get it from all sorts of different openings. So I definitely recommend you learn this sort of structure on what to do when the pawns are situated like this and your opponent has a bad bishop. So where you should be putting your pieces and the plans associated, so on. Just look at a lot of example games. They will give you a rough idea of what to do from the white side. A good example of this is actually to look at stronger players from one side. So let's say if I was studying this from the white side, I could pick a model player and I would study his games, but don't necessarily look at the games he's playing against other strong players. So don't look at the games where the 2700 is playing against other 2700s, because then um, black might not be making as many inaccuracies. So what you could do is look at games where he's playing against significantly lower rated players, just to see how he actually takes advantage of those mistakes. So that's what I would usually do. And a lot of people don't do that as much. But in terms of like picking openings which complement each other for these two, I would say, yeah, it's a little bit different because the structure is different. Because you see here, the bishop is actually not blocked in by the pawn at all. So yeah, it's a little bit different. But if you want something easy, you could go for, say, like the two knights against the Caracan, and this is fairly simple opening to learn, and stick to things which are fairly similar. You could even go for like the advance, which is somewhat similar, but also different because the bishop is going to f5. So any recommendations for a solid but not so mainstream reply to 1d4? Yeah. So mainstream openings are mainstream for a reason. So I made a tier list video with all the responses for black, so you can check that out. It probably explains it a lot better. But say for a not so mainstream opening, but at the same time want to be solid, uh, I mean, Nimzo is a great choice for just people starting out, but it is fairly mainstream, I would say. But I don't think you should avoid mainstream, like I said, just because um, a lot of people play it. It doesn't mean that a lot of people are going to know it. There are many lines in the Nimzo, so I don't think you should avoid an opening just because a lot of people play it. What you should do instead is just pick a different line, which people may not be familiar with. Let's say you played a Nimzo and a lot of people play d5 here. Well, you can pick other moves. You can play c5, there's b6, there's castles, there's all sorts of plans involved. You can go for d6 plans and so on. So for people who want something solid, I still recommend the Nimzo is a great choice. Other than that, I mean, Slav is also a really excellent choice. So I think for beginning players, I think Slav is an excellent choice. It just doesn't lead your bishop to any problems. So I feel like it's a lot easier than e6, where the plans are a lot harder. So I feel that e6 QGD is played a lot as well, but I think this is more of like a opening people play at a very high level because they say they're trying to equalize. But when you're starting out, I feel that it's harder to play because the bishop is locked in and you're a little bit more cramped. So Sicilian Khan. So yeah, I've played Sicilian Khan for a long time. So I know Andreakin plays a lot of Khan. Actually, if you look at all the top players and you look at all the games they played back when they were actually lower rated, let's say below 2500 or below 2600, then you'll find that a lot of them actually started with sort of E6 Sicilians. For example, Peter Svidler used to play a lot of Sicilian Khans, as well as I know Caruana even played a lot of E6 type Sicilians. I know Artemayev plays a lot of these type of Sicilians as well. So out of the current top players, I'd say mainly Andreevkin and Artemayev um, at the very top level. But if you do a database search, you should be able to find sort of a lot of players who sort of recurringly just play it a lot. It's very popular. It's sort of like 2500 level um, in master level games. So. So I've been studying a lot of Queen's Gambit lately. It seems that it is not something white wants because it leads to a lot of tactical rather than positional play. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, so for the Queen's Gambit accepted, um, it really depends on what line white plays. So if you play something very dry, then you might not get that exciting of position. So, like, for example, after takes e3, something like this is fairly dry, and this will become a little bit more positional. Whereas at the same time, white can play something like e4. And this is going to get a lot sharper. Stuff like e5, bishop takes e4, and so on. Like this will lead to some very sharp positions. So I think the onus is really on white to go for what type of position he really wants. So as black, we're sort of just reacting to what line white chooses. So for hyper modern openings, things like B3 and the ready and so on. So stuff like this, I think it's sort of a good starter. So this is not too different from the Catalan, I would say. So I would say Catalan is a better version of this though, because it actually leads to positions which will help you a lot more overall. Whereas moves like B3 and the ready is also fine, but the positions will be somewhat different, and it's more specific to that opening in general. But I have no problems with moves like this. I think if you want to avoid a lot of theory and just get a playable position from white and focus on the middle game and other aspects, then it's a great opening. I did a video on 1b3 as well. I think it's an excellent line, especially in sort of faster time controls where people probably have not seen it as much. So there's quite a lot of traps here. I think I did a video on like 3 different traps that black can fall into. I think one of the most common traps here was against King's Indian players. So when it comes to opening, it's very player specific as well. At least for me, it is. Because if you find a player only plays a specific opening, you can definitely catch them off guard. For example, if my opponent plays only a King's Indian here, then you might consider playing this. And then, for example, if they play the move pawn to c5 here, then after captures, already like after queen a5, c3, I think black is already losing a pawn. I've had this numerous times in blitz games online already, and I think Hikaru has got this quite a number of times against really strong players. And the only one who sort of squirmed away was Magnus, and still managed to win. But most players here, for most players, you'll just be a pawn down with not much compensation. For example, after you just take the pawn here, and you can even just capture the knight and play knight d4, and white is just a pawn up here. So and yeah, Hikaru plays b3 all the time, and lots of people play b3 and sort of these ready type setups, just because for one thing in Blitz and Rapid, I don't think they want to give away their repertoire. So I think playing moves like this is very good because you can just get a decent playable position at the same time. You don't have to show all your lines by playing e4 or d4. So in terms of my goals for chess right now, I guess my goals in chess have always been to sort of reach the maximum level I possibly can. But being from Australia and haven't been playing so much past 2 years or so, sort of limits how much I can improve. So I think at some point I will sort of go back into competitive chess a lot more and try to get my rating up and see how far I can get. I think I dropped a little bit below 2500 already, but I think eventually I want to break 2600. That would be sort of my main goal in chess at the moment in terms of playing. In terms of actual teaching, I do teach a lot now, so I enjoy teaching. I want to teach a lot more, and I guess YouTube is a great outlet for that. And eventually, I will probably go into streaming more as well. But for now, I think the focus will mainly be on my coaching and YouTube channel. Mm. I think that's all the questions, unless I've missed any. If I missed any, like you can let me know in the chat. But I don't see any more questions. At least not related to chess openings.
All right, Moulton. Well, thank you very much. If you'd like to, we can move to a discussion channel where
So
people
what's
can.
the worst case scenario if someone plays the Night Elf without having a base of knowledge and experience? Will they just lose a lot? So if you play the Night Elf at a low level without too much knowledge, I think you'll probably lose more games mainly from the middle game because you're not familiar with what to do, and you don't really have any idea of the plans that come along with it, where to put your pieces, and so on. But in general, I feel that you can play openings like this. It doesn't really matter so much until your opponents can actually take advantage of it. So it should be fine until you reach sort of a higher level where your opponents start to take advantage of you.
Moulton, can you hear me? Moulton, are you there?
Oh yeah, I'm here. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
So if you'd like, what we can do is we can either keep answering questions through the lecture chat. We could end things off, or what we could do is we could move to one of the chess talk channels where we could have a more verbal discussion so that people could ask you questions in the voice chat and it could be more conversation focused.
Okay. Yeah.
Would you
Yeah. That
would you
might
like
be
to do that?
better.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Let's move over to Chess Talk 1, and let's continue it there. Great. Yeah. So Molten, if you would be so kind as to reset up your video and your screen, we could start answering questions again.
So do I set that up in this channel or the other channel?
You just do it the exact same way that we did it in Chess Talk in the lecture channel.
Okay.
When did you start playing chess, Molton?
Give me 1 sec. I started playing chess when I was 11.
11.
Pretty late, yeah.
Yeah, relatively late for a Grandmaster, I feel.
I mean, most of the kids my age were far better than me. So.
People are going to feel really silly when I'm a Grandmaster and they ask me, and I'm going to be like, I started playing at 24. What was I remember before you were saying that your the first opening that you really studied and played with for a long time was the French. What was the first opening that you played with white? Well, I think you said it might have been the Scotch. What was sort of like your like first intro to chess opener that got you to maybe 1500?
Intro to chess that got me to 1500. Well, the first opening that got me interested in chess was the King's Gambit.
Mm-hmm.
And that was mainly Morphy's doing. I thought they were the only games in chess, so I just looked at all Morphy games, and that I thought that's how you play chess. And I wasn't interested in sort of the mainline Gyoko pianos, anything like that. So I was far attacking player when I first started. It was only much later that I sort of switched my playing style, and now I'm become more like Karpov. which is weird because he wasn't one of my favorite players when I first started. So,
Yes.
but
Do you think, like, I mean, because when you're attacking, like, I find, you know, with King's Gambit, there's a lot more calculation involved. And when I play like positionally, like if I ever do, I don't do D4, but when I do like more positional stuff, like maybe the Hungarian opening or ready opening, it feels like there's a lot less calculation involved. All I have to do is like know the positional imbalances, and you know I win off positionally. So like it's a lot less stressful to play that
yeah,
way. Do you think,
yeah,
is that true, or like
yeah. I'm not recommending the King's Gambit, by the way.
okay?
I'm
Is
just
it just like more stressful to play? Is that why?
yeah. It's just that what
Yeah.
I enjoyed playing. So I think you should just stick with what you enjoy playing. But in terms of your question, to get to 1500, I would either take a sort of simple approach where you just like play setup type openings, like I mentioned, like Catalan or London or something like that. Or if you want to go into say like E4, then go for lines which are like less unknown. So you could play like the Scotch, for example, but like maybe pick a specific line. So but let's say, give me an example. So again, just stick to like what you know and what you enjoy playing, but maybe go for like offbeat lines as well, which
Oh my god.
which will
That's
put
all.
pressure on your opponent.
That's all me, dude. That's all me. Always offbeat. I play the
So
center game. You know the center game. That's what I play.
so like okay, this is just me, but let's say I'm an aggressive player and I want to avoid some theory, but at the same time I don't want like really bad positions from the opening. So maybe I'll just put my opponent in a difficult spot, and maybe I'll play something like h4 here or something like that. And I know that when I play h4 and I've started this a little bit, I'm gonna gain like 20 minutes on the clock already,
Right.
regardless. And I'm a bit more familiar with the ideas, but at the same time, it's not like a like surprise opening. It's something I can learn. So if you're learning the Scotch, I might learn this as one of my lines, and then eventually I might add like something else. Maybe you learn like b3 f4, something like this. So I would pick one opening that you enjoy the sort of the positions, and then I would slowly add variations to it.
On the subject of the Scotch, what do you think about the Goring Gambit?
Which one's the Goring Gambit? Is it the c3? You play
Yeah,
c3
that's the
here.
one where you play c3 and then let him take on b2 and take with the bishop.
And then you play bishop c4 here.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is okay. I mean, if black takes all 3 pawns, it's sort of suicidal. So
Hmm.
it's not a good idea, but he's probably just going to give up this pawn anyway. I don't think this is like a long-term opening, but I think each opening will have like a sort of level cap. Once you hit it, you'll sort of find your opponents will know what they're doing, and you might find it tougher to play, but you can play this one definitely. Like, what level you at the moment?
I haven't played a USCF rated game in a while. I'm about like 1930 on Lee Chess.
That's quite high. Yeah, like this is one of the openings that will put your opponent under a lot of pressure, but at the same time, like once he specifically finds a concrete solution, then you might not get your advantage anymore. But until then, like you can keep playing it. But yeah, it's not too different from say the Evans Gambit or anything like that. Really, like it's sort of the same onus where as the attacking player you have to play quite accurately, whereas the defending player you can get lucky. So
I'm
yeah.
surprised you said that you didn't like the Smith Mora. I've always found the Smith Mora to be one of the more sound gambits.
Well, no, I like the Smith Mora. So I mean, I even did like a 50-minute video on the Smith Mora, like complete repertoire. So I do like it, but I just feel like there's a level cap to it. So once you get to say past 2000, it's going to be a lot harder. And then your opponent knows you're going to play the Smith Morrow. It's a lot easier to prepare, especially in over the board tournaments. So at that level, I sort of feel like you have to use it more as a surprise weapon.
Okay. There's
So
an
you still
international
can catch.
master
Yeah.
who I follow, Mark Esterman. He like
Mhm.
plays the Mora against everyone, and like
Mhm.
he like I think he drew Anand with it.
Nice.
No, actually, that was a C3 Sicilian, I think, right? Transposed back into C3
Oh,
Sicilian.
it might have been. It was like a Mora declined, I think.
When they take the pawn, do you take with the queen in Smith?
Uh,
So in Smith Mora, so you
Do you
take
take?
here. Yeah.
So you don't take the queen, okay?
no.
Because when you take with the queen, it's kind of like the center game, but it's probably like a worse version of a center game.
Hmm.
I just think to study Molton about what I play as white, what I'm like doing most as white. I guess I play like maybe 2,000 games in it. It's really offbeat. It's center game. But I'm learning like not queen e3 afterwards. I'm learning going back to d3, which is more sound. It seems like.
Sorry, what are the moves?
Oh, I linked you a study if you can have a look. It's in your PMs. I just PM'd you.
Center game. Okay.
Yeah. Do you know anything about this? It's
I
like
do.
norm.
Yes.
Okay, nice.
So the old main line, like there used to be like the old main line is Queen E3, right?
Yes. I've always done that, but I always get into trouble because the fact is his rook is gonna line up to your queen and he's gonna play d5. That's very
Yeah,
troubling.
and there's like this really nice
Yeah.
bullet game. It's one of the best bullet games I ever played. That went
Yeah.
after like rook takes e4 and so on.
Yes, this is some sack line. I don't like to play it too much. And also, like if you don't do anything, like he's gonna play d5 as well. So this one it really prevents him from playing d5 there. You see it, right? He
Mhm.
really that d5 idea. So that's why I've been going for this lately. And there's a trap. There's a trap here when if he takes that a2, his knight is trapped. So a lot of people fall for that as well, which is interesting.
So
Yeah, so go on, keep going.
I
Keep
mean,
going.
in response, I think Queen D3 is a great line. So
You like it?
yeah, I think it's fine. It depends on the level. Like I probably wouldn't play it at like my level, but that's different because so my opponents will be like over 2300, and then maybe I want something a little bit different. But depending on like the situation, like I'd play it in like a rapid tournament or blitz, or maybe as like a surprise, depending on the situation. But
Got you.
yeah, but at sort of a level below that, I think it's totally fine that you can play it anytime.
Yeah.
Like Nepomniachtchi plays this stuff all the time.
Yeah, I've seen these games in it, but he goes to Queen e3. So like if I'm used to this opening, what's another similar opening, but that's like more sound than this? That's gonna get me maybe the Scotch Gambit, like you were saying, or maybe Evans Gambit. I don't know.
Well, the fact that you're playing this opening tells me you're probably like more aggressive in open positions, and you're
Yeah,
sort of
it's like
playing this
swing.
maybe to
Yeah.
avoid the sort of theory and more common lines in C3.
Well, it's actually
Yeah.
just to race, like just to race them because in this line I get to castle queenside all the time, right? So
Mhm.
it's just about a race, and a lot of times in a race it's unclear, like you don't know what's going on, so it's kind of cool. Like if they make one slip, then you just win. So
Okay, so basically you just want sharp positions.
I don't know, like racy positions where you get to castle queenside. Is there something similar that's sound? Is there like
Against
Vienna?
E4, E5, you mean?
I guess Scotch you can castle queenside, right? In Scotch lines.
Sometimes, yeah, but not all the time.
Mhm.
You want sort of opposite side casting
Yeah,
type
opposite
positions. Yeah?
castling positions as white. Is there another line I can get into this kind of thing? But maybe it's more sound. I don't know.
Let me think.
Because I know Scotch and Vienna, they both can transpose into it, but not as often. Because this is kind of like queenside castling by force, you know.
It's, I mean,
Right.
from all the lines I know, it's very rare after e4, e5 that white is casting queenside too often. Apart from like the Scotch, I mean, the Scotch is the only one I really know.
Mm. Okay.
Apart from this, maybe since you already played the Scotch, maybe you can learn like the knight takes Scotch as well, and then
Yes, I know. After this,
like this.
yes, exactly. And then your queen goes on e2 in this variation. I know this one. I know this line. And then you try to queenside castle. Yeah.
But what else is there? Because if you go bishop c4, I mean that's not really queenside casting position.
Right. But it's a nice, very nice gambit. I like it. Love that gambit.
It's just one of my favorite gambits. I think it's one of the more sounder ones. Yeah,
Yeah.
easier to play as well. But
Mhm.
in yeah, it's not so easy to queenside castle.
Mhm.
I mean, you can play like Italian positions in queenside castle as well. So Italian
Yeah.
positions, a lot of people think of pretty dry and not so exciting. But like even the four knights can be
Actually, I don't.
exciting.
I
Yeah.
think Italians is very exciting because you can get into Evans Gambit or Fry Lever. That's very exciting. I think
hmm
those are very exciting stuff. So, but
So
wait, how do you queenside castle in Italian? I've never actually seen that.
so or four knights. So for beginners, they play four knights a lot.
Yeah.
So once you get a bit higher, you'd put your pawn on c3 and then play your knight to d2. But the general idea is basically we're waiting for black to castle and create a weakness on the king side.
Okay.
So for example, let's say I'm playing white or I'm playing black. So mainly this is mainly for black side. But okay, let's say we're playing white and our
You
opponent
have to
just
play
plays h6,
Bishop
g3, maybe
E3.
let's say bishop e3 or a3. I'm just giving an example. Let's say after they castle too early, then you could throw in a move like g4.
Mm-hmm.
And then we see the idea is that white's just waiting, and
Right.
after they've provoked this weakness of h6, then we have a target g4,
Mm-hmm.
g5. So
That's pretty awesome. I love this idea already. It's like very non-committal. Yeah.
I, I actually play this as black more. So
Okay. Well,
yeah,
so that's not the best approach by Black, though, right? Is it?
so I mean I usually play this way from the black side as well. So like if
Okay.
they play h3, I'll play h6, and sometimes they'll castle, and I just play g5.
Oh, I see. I see.
Yeah, then
So you
just play
can just like,
g4.
yeah, it's kind of like a reversed one. You know?
Yep. So
Uh,
I'll do the same thing.
I have another question about the Dutch. Uh, if
hmm
nobody else has any other questions right now, but so like I know there's a couple other options you can go for, like the Stonewall is. I've heard like conflicting things about the Stonewall. Like I've heard some people say it's like really sharp and aggressive, and other people say it's more solid and positional. What do you think about that variation?
It is not solid in position. So if you play the Stonewall, it's definitely aggressive. Like, okay, let me show you. Can I just exit from this one?
Yes,
Go
sure,
to this one.
sure. Thanks for that. I really appreciate it. That advice there. I'm gonna try to learn the Italian. I always wanted to learn Italian. Very nice.
Oh, it's more of like an idea. But I would,
Yeah,
if you're a Scotch player, I would stick with the Scotch though, because I feel like, yeah, but you can throw that idea in every so often and play Italian a bit more aggressively.
I think Scotch can lead to like, you know, they can equalize. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe I'll just trade the knights and equalize. I don't know all the theory, maybe, but
Right.
yeah.
Maybe you can try it out. So if you play the Italian, by the way, you could play it with an C392, like I mentioned, which instead of like the 4 knights, which is a little bit dry.
That's nice.
Yeah, you can just try it out, see if you like it. Is this what you're talking about, Stonewall?
Yeah, yeah, this exactly.
Okay, so the question was, is it an aggressive opening or is it a positional opening? Was it?
Hello.
Hello.
Oh, I'm sorry. I interrupted something.
I like this position for black because I don't know. It looks like black has an edge here with the knight on f4, but white also can do the same thing, like jumbo knight on e5. It's
Okay, so
also Mhm.
so to answer your question on the Stonewall, there's a few things I'd look for before I go into a Stonewall, because I don't play a Stonewall regularly. But basically, the structure is all your pawns on white square. So your light squared bishop is a little bit bad, but you can always maneuver it like this way to bring it out, or you can play like this and then go for the c5 pawn break. In terms of playing style, it's not really that positional. I mean, black's plan involves playing a knight to e4 eventually, and then pushing your kingside pawns um, at the kingside. So something like this is your plan, and you're just going to swing and go for a kingside attack. So it's not at all positional. So the reason why it's not positional is because you have so many positional weaknesses. You have this square on e5. Basically, all your dark squares are weak. So if white eventually trades off the dark squared bishops and tries to maneuver pieces to the dark squares, then you just get a worse position. So you need to do something quickly. You can't just sit around there. The longer the game goes, the more likely you'll lose.
No, makes sense.
So you're playing a short-term game, whereas white is playing a long-term game. But I think it's better when white hasn't fianchettoed, because the reason why is you can stick the knight on e4 and go for a direct attack, and it's easier to attack a setup which hasn't fianchettoed, because the way you attack a setup which has fianchettoed is to trade off the fianchettoed bishop usually. But how are you supposed to do that if you have a light square bishop on c8? So this setup is really good, but I'll show you, like, if they play something like this is a lot harder to crack. This is very difficult to play against as black. You can still play it, of course. It's one of the main lines, but it's a lot harder to play against this than if the pawn was on g2. So
Yeah, that makes sense.
but in response, yeah, you try and create counterplay either way. So either in the center or kingside attack, but this just limits the kingside attack potential a lot.
So if say you see that white goes for the fianchetto setup early enough, then the Leningrad is probably a safer option, or at least would give you better prospects if the game goes longer.
Yeah, so if you see a fianchetto setup, I would stick with either the classical setup or the Leningrad. I think would give you better prospects. So you'll find it's a lot easier to play as well. So stick with the pawn on g6 and like this. I think that's a much safer option.
Do you also fianchetto the other bishop? Because you can trade it that way.
But so let's say he plays g3 here. So I would always start with, say, this and this to just see what my opponent plays, and then I'll decide between classical, Leningrad, or Stonewall, which one I want to play. So if he immediately fianchettos, then I probably will just go Leningrad. I'm not going to Stonewall against this. Just I don't feel that it's easy to play for black, whereas Leningrad, I think, is far easier against this setup. Just go for e5, queen e8, like I mentioned.
What are you going to do with the light square bishop here? Are you going to fianchetto?
Something I've been trying with the light squared bishop in these positions is trying to play bishop e6 and then bishop f7 and fix the weakness on that diagonal. Is that any good? Or
Yeah, so the light squared bishop is similar to that of a King's Indian. So it's difficult because either you develop it to e6 later on, like after you play e5, you can develop it to e6 and like you mentioned, put it on f7, or the other option is just to leave it there and then try to get in e5. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you manage to get in e5 like this, and you can just leave your bishop here for like the entire game. And let's say like here, you play f4, and then what you can do is save that tempo, so then you can bring the bishop out in one go later on to g4, somewhere useful.
Taking on
we
f4
just-
would be a mistake here for white, or not? Winning a pawn.
Taking on f4. So black is usually happy to sacrifice a pawn here on f4 in the Dutch, because we'll get moves like, let's say knight to h5 could be a move. You could even take, and then knight h5 could be an option. And what we're doing is getting the f4 square for our knight, and we're creating some sort of blockade there. So for example, pawn takes, you can even go bishop g4 now, and you see the whole point of keeping the bishop back. So we
Thank you.
save that tempo. So yeah, it's difficult. It's like the King's Indian. King's Indian, this bishop's not very good, but it's good for sacrifices. So if I go to like a King's Indian structure, so this is like a mainline King's Indian. Because people always ask like, what do I do with the bishop? And the answer is you don't do anything usually. So the castles. So this is like a mainline King's Indian structure. Something like this. Yeah, and this bishop just doesn't do anything in this position, but it doesn't mean that you should trade it off for like a knight. Let's say the knight goes to b5, you shouldn't trade it off for the knight usually, because it can be still very helpful. But it can be helpful for sacrifices. So for example, let's say you go like queen here, sometimes you can sacrifice the bishop on h3 and so on. So there are positions where that can happen, and also supports the g4 pawn push. So just because the bishop's not developed doesn't mean that it's a bad piece.
That's interesting. It's sort of like pseudo developed. It's doing stuff without being developed.
Yeah, a lot of people will see this bishop and they'll be like, in the structure, they'll say, I'm happy to exchange it off. But once you exchange it off, it's actually a lot more difficult to break through. So not only can you not play g4 as easily, but there's no sacrifices, which means white's never in any danger on the king side. So that's also something just to keep in mind. So for example, let's say a Steinitz variation, which is something like this in the Roy Lopez. So just as an example, let's say he plays this, and then you go here. So if you look at the structure, we're back in a King's Indian. So it's the same as a King's Indian structure, really. But we've lost our light squared bishop. So this is actually not a good thing for black. This is a good thing for white, because that light squared bishop, like I said, is actually very important for a lot of attacking ideas.
Is the pawns also on dark squares, so bishop always good, right? Because it's like a sniper, because we have the dark squares pawns, I guess.
Correct, yeah. But I think the point is that this light square bishop, even though it doesn't look that good, it doesn't have too many squares, it actually is a very important piece in this structure. Yeah. So it has a lot of potential later on. But a lot of people don't realize that. And they happily trade off into this position as black, and then they'll find that it's actually far more difficult to break through.
Do you like white or black in those kind of positions? Okay, with the bishop, the one previously. Like
With
black
the
hasn't-
bishop, yeah.
You
With
like
the bishop, I'll happily take black, yeah. And I mean, I can play either color, but I would happily take black with the bishop. But here, I definitely take white.
Mhm.
Yeah, I definitely take white here for sure.
Do you like one problem that I have is I guess drive positions like when I play, ready or Hungarian, sometimes it's just kind of dry. Or like even maybe like in close Sicilian, I like close Sicilian, but it's sometimes a bit dry. Yeah. Like what's I guess is that because I need to study the ideas more, or like I guess gotta know about the imbalances more or something. Maybe.
I mean, close Sicilian shouldn't be dry. Maybe you're playing the wrong plans because close Sicilian is meant to be quite
Okay, I
aggressive.
do F4 instead of fianchetto usually.
Okay, F4 here.
Because the fianchetto is usually more dry. Yeah, and I try to get rid of his knight with my bishop. Bishop. Sorry, it's like bishop. What is it? Yeah, bishop b5 sometimes. Try to get rid of his knight. I don't know. This is what engine likes and top moves by people as well. I don't know about this position, but in maybe other ones, this is still maybe okay. Like
So
yeah,
this is like a Grand Prix.
is a yeah Grand Prix.
Yeah.
Grand Prix is a bit less dry, I guess. So I'm having a little bit more fun with this, but still, yeah, I guess it's not dry, right? Because I used to play it like the fianchetto way, and it felt very dry. So can you show me the fianchetto way and tell me how that's not dry? I guess. So
So the Grand Prix is basically like a reverse Dutch.
yeah,
So like it's exactly what I showed you before. So you'll get something like
yes,
this Queen E1, F5, Queen H4,
yeah,
and then you'll just attack on the king side. So something like this, Queen H4, Bishop H6, and
yeah.
launch a king side attack. Whereas if you go for
Fianchetto,
G3, it's a slow push.
slow push. Okay.
Slow push, yeah. But I tend to feel that black is very comfortable here.
Yes,
So
this is what I feel like. It just led to a lot of dry positions.
I,
I don't know how to really attack
I,
this one.
I mean, I've played this as black my entire life, and I've never had any problems against the closed Sicilian.
Yes,
So
it's very slow, right?
it's it's a slow push. Yeah, you have to
Mm.
like slowly push your kingside pawns up the
Okay.
board, and you're attacking, but it's a very sort of slow attack. It's
Okay.
like here and push, and you maneuver your knight back, and so on. Something like this, while at the same time black is like pushing here. Yeah. And then you slowly like push all your pawns up and get some sort of attack on the king side.
So which one do you like more, the Grand Prix or this system?
I think Grand Prix is easier to play just because
Yeah.
the plan is just very straightforward. And if you're going to play the Grand Prix, you should follow Gawain Jones.
Gawain Jones.
Yeah, so
Okay.
Gawain Jones is a very strong English player. He played the Grand Prix for a long time. He even wrote a book on it, but
Okay.
I would just watch his games. So
Right.
look through the database for his games, and he
Sweet.
is a good example. Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Does anyone have any more questions for Molton? All right.